So I want to start by talking to you about the topic for this event. It's the Sustainable Business Summit. And so for you, what does it actually mean to be a sustainable business?
The Brundtland report, I think it was late 80s, 1987 perhaps, they first came up with this concept of sustainable development. And if I remember, I'm paraphrasing it, they effectively said that the definition of sustainable development, the way they defined it, is to be able to meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of future generations. And that's basically the most pithy way of describing it. And I think they nailed it, because that's what sustainability is. How do you make a business or a country or an economy work in a way that you meet the needs of the present generation, which are economic, developmental, etc., but at the same time have an eye for a much longer term future? How do you look after generation 2, 3, 4, 5 after that? It's interesting that, for the longest time, at least my thinking around it used to be around the S, which is now being called ESG, the social agenda around this. Because to a large extent, I thought a lot about the social equity problem. How do you make sure that you satisfy developmental agendas today, but at the same time you're building for a longer term social thing, education, healthcare, systems of taking people out of economic development and out of the poverty trap. But one of the things that's evolved, and particularly in the last 10, 20 years, frankly after COP21 in 2016, is the recognition that actually some of the biggest challenges we have are environmental challenges. So how do you make sure that the Earth, the planet itself, is sustainable, is there for future generations, leave alone the economic development agenda for people? I like the way Kate Raworth from Oxford actually frames it. She's got this whole concept of donut economics. It's simple, but the idea, if you take the 17 SDGs, you'll find a chunk of them, a number of them are around planetary boundaries. So ozone in the air, the amount of pollutants, etc. So there are 9 planetary boundaries. And the recognition is that for us to be able to keep the Earth itself, the planet, sustainable, over time we've got to live within the constraints of those 9 planetary boundaries. So many of the SDGs relate to those. But at the same time, she defines that as a ring. At the same time, she also defines an inside ring. And the inside ring she defines as the economic considerations, so hunger, poverty, development, etc. And her basic theory is that as we develop, we've got to see how we stay inside the outside ring, but outside the inside ring. So we've got to make sure we're above the floors of economic development. And to me, that's the best way to think about what we're trying to do. Make sure that we create a future for people, the bottom of the pyramid today, the bottom of the pyramid tomorrow, but stay within the confines of the planetary boundaries that are material.
And you've been in this role since 2009. I can only imagine that in that time your thinking on this topic has evolved, and the expectations you're feeling in your role to be focusing on ESG and sustainability and the back and forth debates on how much the value of each of those things are. Tell us a little bit more about how is this evolved as part of your day-to-day work?
Yeah. So I'll go back to, the social agenda is not only something I thought about, but that's been very fundamental to DBS for the longest time. We were created as a company in the late 60s to help with the development of Singapore. And in the late 90s, we were merged with POSB, which was a savings bank. So, this idea of neighbors first, bankers second, that's the tagline. That was in our DNA. And so for the longest time, this idea of being sustainable, i.e. being relevant to society, doing real things for real people, and therefore having a purpose, that's been deeply rooted in our DNA. And therefore I sometimes tell people, we are bankers to like 5 million people. Everybody in this country has a DBS POSB account. Few people realize that 3.5 million of those people don't make any money for us. We lose money on them. So if we were just focused on the short-term agenda around shareholder value creation, we'd basically not bank them. But we know we have a different role. We're the people's bank. And so you have to be part of this, because how do you get those people out of the poverty trap? How do you give them a future? How do you give them the opportunity to build a new life? So that's always been deeply ingrained in our DNA. What has shifted and evolved? Shifted is a strong word. I've been an environmentalist since I was young, as a keen bird watcher. But what has evolved in the last few years is the focus on the environmental agenda, and particularly the climate agenda. Even now, biodiversity is less of a subject on the radar, but the climate agenda has really picked up steam in the last few years. And therefore, starting thinking about the role that companies like us have in terms of addressing the climate challenges and transitioning the world to a less carbon-intensive business model, that's occupied front and center space in our thinking in the last 6, 7 years. And that's caused us to step up our game. We've now got a board sustainability committee. We created a position called Chief Sustainability Officer. We didn't have that. We focused a lot on creating a complete overarching program for a sustainability agenda, including a large focus on our own business activities, what we do with our customers. So our capital raising activities, our financial inclusion activities, our transition, our products that we offer, all of this is relatively new last 5, 6 years. I hasten to add, that even though we started 5, 6 years ago, I think we made a lot of progress. Today we're regarded as one of the leaders in the world in the space. But I'll be very honest, it wasn't on the agenda 10 years ago.
And as you're talking about how much that's changed over the last 6 years or so, especially around climate pressure, has the pressure around that change come from your customers, come from investors? Is it coming from government? Where are you feeling that pressure to make those changes?
Well, maybe I'm being too politically correct. I wouldn't call it pressure. I would call it motivation.
Encouragement.
But I think most of the motivation originally came from investors first, customers. So a lot of customers are beginning to look for green solutions, and surprisingly, from employees. So the young kids that we were hiring were increasingly wanting to know what was our role, what could we do, and how could we make a difference. And we started realizing that our employee value proposition gets strengthened a lot if you have a legitimate and a meaningful agenda around this stuff. But I would say investors were probably primary in terms of focusing our mind around what needed to be done. In truth, many of the governments in our part of the world have been latecomers to the game, right? And so it was not driven through regulation or policy action, and that's in most of the countries where we operate in Asia. I think that's understandable because the starting position for many countries in our region is that the economic development challenges are still paramount. And therefore, the planetary challenges have not been that important to them. But if you ask me the question the other way around, so what drives the process going forward, I think it has to be government regulation and policy agenda. Because if you really want a change at pace, it's got to be supported by policy. Otherwise, we'll not get that kind of change. The reality is that investors and consumers, with the best of intent and minds, can be fickle. So they move around in cycles in terms of what it is that they're seeking. And I was mentioning outside, the FT article yesterday on the investor approach to this in the last year is interesting. The article, if I get the numbers right, said that in the last year, the support for environmental and social proposals at AGMs from the investor community has dropped from 35% to 26% or something. And interestingly, a large company like BlackRock, their support has dropped from 43% to 25%. Massive.
Big change.
Now, you can understand, by the way, I'm not saying this in a negative sense. I think it's very easy to be evangelistic and binary about this from time to time. We must all become net zero tomorrow. Right? But when the shoe really starts to pinch, and then you start figuring out the challenges this poses, then the other issues around what's called a just transition, or how do you make sure that people are fairly handled in the process, starts coming to the fore. And so if you look at the investor rationale, they say that some of these proposals were just too extreme. They were too binary. And we had to look and support proposals that made sense, that were appropriate in transition. So I think you're beginning to see that there's an adjustment around, what is a just transition and how do we make sure that we're pragmatic about what really can be done. Nevertheless, in 12 months, the investor support halved. Right? Similarly, the consumer support. I was talking to another customer of ours yesterday, and it was interesting to me that they said they can see in the last 3 months with inflation pressures, a clear shift in buying patterns in the shopping malls. And particularly the supermarkets. People are dialing down to cheaper products. And the minute you start dialing down to cheaper products, you're actually less bothered about the green marking on the product. You're more concerned about things are so expensive, how do I get the next bread or whatever it is back home? So I think you will see ups and downs for legitimate reasons over time. And the only way that we can have a sustained long-term agenda around this development is for governments and policy action. One big step, for example, in respect to climate has to be carbon pricing. right? And so if you want a price on carbon, whether through a carbon tax process or a cap and trade process or whatever you want, this is a government deal. So the governments have got to step in, be able to create and have a long-term plan. So to that extent, what the Singapore government has done in the last year or so is actually quite admirable. We've got a now price for carbon. We've given guidance on a future price for carbon, which goes all the way up to $25 and $40 per ton. And that focuses everybody's attention better than anything else can.
I want to come back to this topic of the just transition that you brought up. But first, we actually have a poll that we've done that we want to pull up onto the screen so everyone can see. We're doing some Twitter polling to get everyone's opinions on these questions too. So a question that we asked is, which stakeholder is most effective at catalyzing corporate climate action in Asia? So hopefully you can pull that up on the screens. You guys can see it around me here. So we asked investors, consumers, or government, and I think far and away here, government was what people thought was actually going to be most effective. Is this surprising to you? Or
no,
you
so
totally
this is what
agree?
I said. I think going forward, I think policy action, a role of regulation, a role of governments, carbon pricing, taxes, those are going to be critical in getting us to where we want. Now, it is, of course, you've got to understand, governments do what their voters tell them to do. And the voters are consumers. So at the end of the day, if you decide to turn off gas, because Russia turns off gas, and you have no gas in Germany and people are freezing to death in the winter, the governments will do what is appropriate for the voters, and which will mean we've got to find ways to give people heat and electricity and gas. So these are not completely...
it's all intertwined here,
it is intertwined. And investors do what their funders tell them, right? They must get money from somewhere. So at the end of the day, you've got to get broad society consensus that this is the direction of travel and the path you need to follow. But within that consensus, I really think that there's a lot of room and scope for policy, regulation, pricing frameworks to really get a move on.
I want to bring you back to the just transition piece and how that is particularly relevant here in Asia, where there are cities and areas of extreme wealth and areas of extreme poverty. How do we bring both of those groups along with us in this?
So it is a genuine problem. You know, we at DBS made an announcement, commitment to exit coal 3-4 years ago in phases. I have to tell you, in all my tenure as a leader, this is one of the hardest decisions I made, because I really struggled at length with the moral dimension of the decision. It's very easy to, again, take a binary view, because I was pushed by the investors, I was pushed by the NGOs, I was pushed by government saying, you know, coal's bad, get out. But I grew up in a country where electricity was a premium. I grew up all my life where we had 12 hours of blackouts and brownouts. And the only way we could study at night is we had diesel generators. And there's parts of my family even today who live in rural India and the villages, they don't get electricity. So here I'm thinking that electricity is a fundamental right. People need light. Kids, what do you say to a kid in Semarang or somewhere in the middle of Indonesia who's struggling to get electricity to do their studies or eat their food? And for us to say, look, I'm going to sit outside and make a moral judgment on electricity use is less important because the planetary considerations are more important. Am I the right person to say that? Shouldn't the elected government decide that? Shouldn't the democracy of Indonesia decide that? So it's not an easy choice to make. And I struggle with this all the time. How do you make sure that you get the balance right between looking at the developmental social needs of people while doing what we think is important, getting the planetary conditions right? Let me give you another example where we have struggled with it. Palm oil. Now, palm oil is less a climate issue, it's more a biodiversity issue. We move from rainforest to monoculture, and so that is a problem for biodiversity. It's as big a problem as climate in my mind. But on the other hand, there's the reality that there are about 14 million households in Indonesia and Sumatra who rely on small estate palm oil for a living. The Indonesian government 30, 40 years ago transmigrated millions of families from Kalimantan to Sumatra and gave them these 1 acre plots to make their living. So the kids, the education, the healthcare, everything relies on this 1 acre plot. And so if you take a binary view saying, hey, stop financing palm oil, get out of this business. So what happens to those 14 million people? Do you leave it to the government? Do you leave it to the fortitude of fate? So these issues of how do you balance, make the trade-offs are tough decisions. And sometimes as a financer, we sit and figure, is it right for us to play God? I don't subscribe to it, but Dr. Mahathir some time ago called this economic colonialism. He said, the people in the north, 10% of the world, is now guiding what we need to do after, doing this carbon stuff for 200 years. Now, I think he's got an extreme view, but the underlying spirit that we've got to get this right is correct. At the UN for 20 years, the big debate between the north and south, therefore, was that, okay, we all need to do this, the planet is burning, but how do we make sure that there is an economic leveling between the people who've been actually using carbon? If you go to the US even today, carbon consumption is 22 tons of carbon per annum per person. If you go to Indonesia, it's 1.7 tons. So how do you redress that? Right? And therefore, there's a big debate that there should be $100 billion of money, effectively, which needs to flow from the north to the south. Agreement on this was, I think, reached in Kyoto something 20 years ago. So far, zero money flowed. Right? So we have to deal with this, that there are other challenges you've got to deal with side by side with the challenges to the planet. One of the things I've been most excited about, it's a diversion from your direct question, is I think in the last 2-3 years, this pickup of the voluntary carbon markets, I think is an opportunity to redress that balance, to get the economics more leveled across the world. Because with 2,000 companies having made voluntary or net zero commitments in the last 2 years, it's quite clear to me that many of them will not be able to change their business models overnight. These are large, extant infrastructures which need to shift. But through the voluntary carbon markets, many of them are prepared to make financial commitments to really decent carbon projects, which happen to be in countries like Indonesia and in the south. So that might help redress some of the economic challenges we have around this just transition issue. But it's the classic naughty problem.
Do you find it helpful to work with others on this? Like, for example, is GFANZ helpful for you? Net Zero Banking Alliance. Like, is this something where you're looking to your peers and you're like, okay, if you're going to take this cold jump, I'll take the cold jump too? Or how helpful is that for you?
It's actually helpful, obviously. There's power in many people, and you get some of the effect you're talking about. But I tell you, there's help from two or three other reasons as well. Number one, the issues are complex. And therefore, the more people who are applying their minds to it, and the more you can talk to, the better and more nuanced your own thinking becomes on what is good and what's not good. Everybody's struggling with the same issues. And therefore, whether it's the GFANZ or the Net Zero Alliance, it gets a lot of people together to understand and talk to the issues. That's helpful. The second big thing is I think you need a level playing field around the world. You need consistency in standards, in rules, in measurement processes, in disclosure standards. Global agencies, both public sector, private sector, GFANZ, they help in making sure that there is a consistency in how do you approach it, what do you measure, how do you get forward. So that's extremely helpful as well. And then finally, it's your third point said, it's a galvanizing platform, right? And so it just energizes everybody to get on the right boat.
So imagine we have about 2 minutes left. Imagine we're back here next year having this conversation again. What do you think is going to change about sustainability, ESG in the next year?
Laura, I think we are in the midst of a really interesting time. On the one hand, there are some headwinds to the progress that have been made in the last 5 years. And the headwinds come from the Ukraine-Russia war and the focus on energy security suddenly. Right? And so I started off saying that all over Europe, the fact that you're held hostage to gas, you might not get gas, electricity is a premium, means in the last 6 months, people are reopening coal mines, people are relying more and more on gas. The Australians have stopped exporting coal to China because guess what? They can now export it to Germany instead, and they get a better price. So you're seeing some headwinds from that standpoint. And therefore, that's going to be somewhat challenging in terms of the pace of progress. But I also see the glass half full. I think you're also seeing progress in a positive sense. One, I'm quite encouraged that notwithstanding the short-term energy challenges, most countries and regions have reiterated the commitment to stepping up the renewable or low-carbon energy agenda. Right? And so I think the direction of travel will become faster, not slower. Second, I think a lot of governments have started actually raising money for the purpose. The EU head of budget was around in the region recently. They want to do this $800 billion fund, of which $250 billion will be on green. The Singapore government announced $35 billion of a green bond for green social development. So I think people are really committing to long-term fundraising and long-term investments in making that transition happen. So I do think you continue to see sustained momentum. One of the other things I'm encouraged by is the S, not just G. I think there's been a rethink in the last 2 years on the back of COVID in terms of fiscal policies and fiscal agendas. The amount of money the governments have been able to spend or willing to spend on looking after the social needs at the bottom of the pyramid also gives you some confidence that people are rethinking the agenda. The IMF 2 years ago would have told you a deficit of 3% and debt of so much is complete no-no. Today they're all changing and saying, if it makes sense for the economy and the people, maybe you should consider it. So I do think the long-term trends are being aided. There will be some short-term ups and downs and headwinds. But on the whole, I think we're headed in the right direction.
Fantastic. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
All
Join
right.
me in thanking
Thank you very
Piyush Gupta, CEO of DBS Bank.